Picture this. In the brothels of ancient Athens, the price of a night with a woman was no more than the cost of 2 barley flatbreads, cheaper even than a jug of low-quality wine. These women, called porni, occupied the very bottom tier of the social hierarchy, the word itself marking them as little more than property. Court orations by Demosthenes and Lysias describe how porni would serve between 6 and 10 clients each day, earning barely enough to afford a small portion of lentils. The real wealth went to the brothel owners, who amassed considerable fortunes, some of which were funneled into the city's treasury through taxation. In Athens, the law placed no minimum age on those forced into prostitution. Archaeological evidence and historical records make it clear that girls as young as 10 to 13 were subjected to exploitation in these establishments. In the bustling port of Piraeus, the air was thick with salt and sweat. Merchants unloaded amphorae of wine, sacks of grain, exotic perfumes from Egypt, and silks from the East. But the most profitable cargo often didn't come in barrels or baskets. It came in chains. Girls, some barely past childhood, were herded off ships like livestock. Many had been stolen from Thrace, Scythia, or the islands of the Aegean. Others were sold by their own desperate families, the crushing weight of poverty heavier than the shame of such a bargain. Once inside the brothels, pornoboskoi dens run by ruthless owners, they were stripped, inspected, and priced. A patron's coins didn't just buy intimacy, they bought the right to anything, and there were no limits. Despite the romanticized myths, not every love worker in ancient Greece lived like the famed courtesans draped in fine linen, debating politics over goblets of wine. Most were porni, street-level prostitutes working in cramped, dimly lit rooms that stank of unwashed body, and cheap wine. The pornoboskos would advertise them with painted signs or crude statues outside the door, sometimes even displaying them naked in the entryway so customers could choose like picking meat at the market. There were no laws to protect them. If a client became violent, there was no recourse. Their bodies belonged to the brothel until every debt, inflated and impossible to pay off, was settled, and debts could last a lifetime. And here's the part history tries to smooth over with marble and myth. While Athens spoke of democracy and philosophy, its streets ran on the unspoken truth that desire was an industry, one that devoured the powerless and left no graves for the forgotten. Tonight, as we descend into the shadows of this golden age, we will follow their footsteps, into the rooms where the candles burned low, the voices slurred with wine, and the cries were swallowed by the music of the aulos flute. Because history remembers the philosophers, but it forgot the suffering of the women who paid for their freedom with their flesh. The streets that fed on flesh. By the time a young girl, or sometimes a boy, set foot in the teeming port districts of Athens, their fate was already sealed. The air itself seemed to whisper the price of a body. Fishmongers shouted in the agora. Perfumed oil sellers fanned the scents of myrrh and rosewater. But somewhere between the spice stalls and the pottery vendors, other eyes hunted. Men in fine wool chitons and threadbare tunics alike scanned the crowd for the same thing: youth, beauty, and desperation. In the shadow of the Parthenon's marble glory, the streets were littered with humanity's discarded promises. Runaway slaves who had failed to escape the brand on their skin. Orphans who had no coin for bread. Farmers' daughters who had come to the city to sell figs, but were cheated and left penniless. In ancient Greece, there was no benevolent hand to catch the fallen. There was only the brothel door, open, dark, and hungry. The pornoboskos, brothel keepers, were businessmen without conscience. They bought human beings the way others bought goats, or amphorae of wine. A girl of 12 could fetch a high price if her features were delicate and her skin unscarred. A boy of similar age, if he was smooth-faced and soft-voiced, could be worth even more in certain circles, his future carved into the twisted appetites of men who would never be named in polite company. These love workers were not draped in silks or reclining on couches as in romanticized pottery scenes. They were crammed into airless rooms, forced to bathe in the same water that had rinsed the sweat from the last client's body. Their labor was not gentle, it was relentless. Some served 10 men in a single day. Others, in the gambling dens near Piraeus, were passed from table to table until their knees bled on the splintered floor. Outside, Athens roared with philosophy and theater. Socrates questioned the nature of virtue. Euripides wrote tragedies that drew tears from the elite. Yet in the same city, within a stone's throw of those hallowed stages, children were learning that their bodies were not their own. The cruelty was not just physical, it was economic. A brothel worker's body was an asset, depreciating with every passing season. By 25, a woman who had been beautiful at 15 was often considered spent, her earnings slashed, her food ration cut. Some were turned out into the streets, too old for the pornoboscos to bother with, too young to find honest work, and too broken to survive without selling what little was left of themselves. The marketplace of flesh. The sun had barely risen over Athens, yet the market was already alive with voices, not of grain sellers or potters, but of men negotiating the price of another human being's body. In a shadowed corner of the agora, beyond the stalls of olive oil and bronze trinkets, stood the sex district, a place the wealthy called indispensable and the moralists called filth. Here, in plain sight, bodies were commodities, and desire was just another form of currency. Some of these men and women had once been citizens, proud children of Athens, but now they wore nothing but thin, faded garments meant to show more than they concealed. Others were foreigners, captured in wars or bought from pirate ships, their language still strange to Greek ears. They were all labeled the same, hetairai, if they had some skill in art or conversation, porni, if they had nothing but their flesh to offer. A pornoboskos, a pimp in the most unapologetic sense of the word, stood at the center, his hands counting coins, while his eyes appraised the trembling figures before him. He was a broker of human pleasure, setting the price as if selling meat. The younger, the unblemished, the exotic fetched the highest rates. A girl from Thrace, with pale hair, might earn him a small fortune in a single week. A boy from Ionia, barely into manhood, might be rented out to the same man night after night until his spirit shattered. Those who could not smile convincingly, who could not mask their fear or revulsion, were punished. A whip across the back, bread withheld, or worse, being sold to a brothel on the city's edge where the clientele were brutal laborers who paid in copper scraps. The stench of cheap wine, sweat, and stale incense clung to the air. Inside the dim, narrow rooms behind the stalls, business was conducted on straw mats, with no privacy but a thin curtain, no care for comfort. No thought of the person beneath, only the act, the transaction, the satisfaction of the buyer. And when the men were finished, they left without looking back, stepping into the sunlight as if they had not just reduced a living soul to a commodity. Sold like livestock, the slave market of Athens did not hide its filth, it flaunted it. Stone platforms lined the square, each one holding human beings who were displayed as if they were jars of imported wine, to be examined, touched, and purchased at leisure. For a hetaira born into slavery, the sale was the first initiation into humiliation. Traders would strip the women entirely naked, not only to prove that they were unblemished, but to parade their bodies for potential buyers who were less interested in work ability and more in the smoothness of skin, the symmetry of hips, or the fullness of breasts. The auctioneer's voice would rise above the chatter, declaring a name that was often not their birth name, but a new one, chosen to sound exotic or seductive. A Thracian girl might be renamed Chryseis, Golden One, even if she'd never seen gold in her life. A girl from Anatolia could be called Melita, Honeybee, as though she was nothing more than a sweet thing to consume. Men gathered close, fingers probing muscles, pinching thighs, tugging hair to see if it was real. Teeth were inspected like those of a horse. Some would even force the women to walk, bend, or dance, assessing flexibility in ways that left no doubt about what they were buying. Price was determined by perceived beauty and purity, though virginity was often manufactured with lies. A girl could be violated by a trader on the road to Athens and still be sold as untouched to inflate her price. The buyer rarely cared about the truth, only the fantasy. And when the hammer fell and the money changed hands, the girl was led away by a rope around her neck or wrist. No farewells were allowed. No family could follow. Her old life, whatever it had been, was erased. From that moment forward, she was property in the most absolute sense. Some buyers were brothel owners, men who would force the woman into relentless service until their bodies broke. Others were private clients, wealthy Athenians who purchased a single girl for exclusive use, often until they tired of her and resold her like a worn-out garment. The cruelty was casual, the transaction was routine, and for the women who had been paraded naked before strangers, it was the start of a sentence that could last a lifetime, one in which their bodies were both their prison and their only currency. The price of flesh. For all their beauty, skill, and wit, the love workers of ancient Greece were never free from the crushing weight of their own commodification. Every touch, every laugh, every glance was bought and sold. Even the most celebrated hetairai, who dined with philosophers and debated politics with kings, carried an invisible collar around their necks, a reminder that, in the eyes of the law, they were property before they were people. The market in flesh was meticulously organized. Brothel owners kept ledgers as precise as any merchant of olive oil or fine wine, recording the name, origin, and specialties of each woman or man. Payment was counted in coins, but the true cost was extracted from the body and the soul. Nights blurred into mornings, and bodies that once glowed with youth began to wither under the constant strain. Diseases spread quickly in the cramped, sweat-soaked chambers of the lower houses. Without medicine or mercy, many love workers simply disappeared from the streets, their absence marked only by a new entry in the ledger, a fresh name, another life to be burned out in service of lust and profit. But perhaps the cruelest wound was social. A love worker could become famous, even influential, yet never truly belong to the society they served. Men might spend fortunes to possess them for a single night. Poets might immortalize their faces in verse, and yet, when the wine was gone and the lamps went out, they returned to a world that viewed them as tainted, unworthy of marriage, unworthy of respect. Some tried to save enough silver to buy their freedom, dreaming of a quiet life away from the city's glare. Few succeeded. For most, their beauty faded faster than their debts, and when the allure was gone, the streets welcomed them back with the same cold indifference as the day they first arrived. It was the unspoken truth of ancient Greece. Isi's glittering world of pleasure, the flesh that fed the city's fantasies was the same flesh it quietly destroyed.